It's Friday, November the 8th. From The Economist in London, this is The Week Ahead, a look at some of the stories that will be in the headlines next week. I'm Daniel Franklin, Executive Editor at The Economist.
And I'm Tom Standage, the Digital Editor. In The Week Ahead, China's communist leaders gather for an important plenum, Munich holds a referendum on whether to bid for the Winter Olympics, Janet Yellen appears before the Senate Banking Committee, and Sony launches the PlayStation 4. Daniel, let's start with the communist plenum. They seem to have an awful lot of these meetings, so which are the really important ones and why does this one matter?
Well, this is the plenum of the Central Committee, and the third plenums of a particular period of a Central Committee tend to be the ones that really matter for reforms. You go back to 1978 when it was the third plenum that Deng Xiaoping announced his reforms that really did change China and were responsible for what became known as China's rise, extraordinary economic growth. So there are very high expectations now of this third plenum, which will be held behind closed doors in Beijing. But it is a chance for Xi Jinping, the still relatively new leader of China's party and its president, to impose his reform agenda. So there's been high hopes that this would be a time and a lot of chatter about the sorts of bold reforms that he might introduce. One area to watch is reform of state enterprises, these really powerful players in the Chinese economy which have become much too powerful in terms of their financial clout, their ability to invest in projects of dubious economic value. Another is land reform, and that's extremely politically sensitive, but giving Chinese people from the countryside a proper title to their land would be enormously liberating, but it is a threat to the power of local communist leaders who use control over the land to enrich themselves, and so a truly bold third plenum would tackle land reform as well as the state-owned enterprises.
So we may get some hint next week of just how bold Xi Jinping is actually prepared to be.
Tom, on Sunday, people in Munich will vote on whether they want to try to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. Now, surely everybody wants to host these enormous big sporting events.
Well, that's the surprising thing. Enthusiasm for hosting these big sporting jamborees seems to be declining, at least in some parts of the world. So Munich actually hosted the main Olympic Games in 1972, and so if it were to host the Winter Olympics in 2022, it would become the first city to have done both of them. But there's quite a lot of objections to it. There are environmental objections, people are worried about the construction that would be necessary, and there's also grumbling about the terms that the International Olympic Committee imposes on cities. Essentially, it asks them to take on all the risks and bear all the losses, and it just sits there and takes the money. And a lot of people think that's unreasonable. The mayor of Munich is very keen on this, but it's not just down to the people of the city. There are 3 neighbouring regions where the alpine events would be held, and they all have to approve it as well. And so the influence of environmental groups will be key in those areas. If any of them object, the whole thing is off. And the deadline for actually submitting a bid is November the 14th. So this is a very last-minute thing. Were Munich to say yes, it would have quite a strong claim to this because there are no other alpine cities bidding. Oslo may bid. There are bids from Kazakhstan and from the Ukraine, but Munich would be very favourably looked upon. But I think the broader thing here that's happening is that there seems to be a souring on the whole idea of hosting these big events. They can be coming out parties for entire countries. Beijing in 2008 is an obvious example. And they can also be sort of advertisements for come to this city and so on. And this is what the mayor of Munich is pushing. But voters, particularly in these cash-strapped times, are saying, well, hang on a minute, are we really getting a good deal out of this? And an awful lot of the time they're concluding that they're not. And so as a result, the kind of countries who are actually bidding for this and doing these sorts of things are increasingly the sheikhs, the oligarchs, the dictators, and so we're seeing strange things happening like the Sochi Winter Olympics, which if there were gold medals in corruption and homophobia, Russia would sweep the field, and frankly rather bizarre awards of sporting events to different places. So I think the Munich referendum, whichever way it goes, the fact that they're having it at all shows you that there is sort of increasing scrutiny being given to the real benefits of hosting these sorts of events.
And presumably if Munich does go for it, they'll be aiming for a slightly lower price tag than the 50 billion that Sochi will be spending on the Games.
Indeed. And also on November the 14th next week, Janet Yellen is going in front of the Senate Banking Committee to be confirmed as Ben Bernanke's successor. Is this a foregone conclusion?
Well, I think she will get it, but there'll be a bit of political drama. There'll be attempts to hold things up, particularly from the likes of Rand Paul, who's on the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, no friend of the Feds. And there'll be some probing of Janet Yellen's stance on the sort of unconventional policies that the Fed is now engaging in. So I think it will be a chance to get a sense of, if you like, a bit of forward guidance on what a Yellen Fed would be like. And in particular, and the whole question of when it might raise interest rates. Might Janet Yellen make the conditions still a bit tougher for that to start? So reducing the level of unemployment that America would have to reach for interest rates to start rising, or perhaps even adding a condition that inflation would have to be at a certain level, say around 1.75%. If interest rates are to rise again, there's a real worry at the moment that inflation is too low and needs to start rising again. It's not as if America is about to dip into outright deflation, but inflation is far below the 2% target that the Fed would like to see it at. And if you get a real recovery starting, inflation would have to rise somewhat. The real drama here was over who Barack Obama would nominate to be Fed chairman, and once it became clear that Larry Summers, who was at one point the front runner, was dropping out, I think the expectation was clear that it would be Janet Yellen and that she would get confirmation. Tom, finally, let's turn to the event that really matters, at least to some people, next week. And that's the launch of PlayStation 4.
Well, this is the beginning of the next console cycle proper, because we get the launch of the PlayStation 4 in the US next week, and then the Xbox, the new Xbox, which confusingly is called the Xbox One, although it's actually the third Xbox, that follows the week after, and then launches in countries outside the US come after that. So we're really seeing the two big players in this market now going head to head. The Nintendo next generation console, which came out last year, hasn't been doing terribly well. What's really striking about these two boxes, though, is that since the last PlayStation and Xbox came out, the market has changed completely. And the reason it's changed completely is because of the iPhone and other smartphones and tablets like the iPad, because these have become the most popular gaming devices in the world, and they really are giving grown-up consoles and handheld consoles a run for their money. What we saw in the previous cycle with the Nintendo Wii in particular was that gaming was reaching out to a broader audience, people who maybe hadn't tried it before. But those people are very happy playing things like Angry Birds on iPads. And so the sales of the Wii successor haven't done terribly well, and the new Sony PlayStation and the Microsoft Xbox are really pulling out all the stops to try and attract people who aren't necessarily hardcore gamers to buy them. So you can stream TV and movies through them. There are social features. They've got new sorts of controllers. They really are trying everything. But I think ultimately this is a market that has matured, and the console model where you buy these very expensive boxes and then you buy very expensive games that run on them is really something that only very dedicated gamers are going to continue to want to do. So we are going to see queues next week, we're going to see crowds, we're going to hear sob stories in the run-up to Christmas about how people can't get hold of these things for their children, but the big question is going to be how quickly sales keep going, whether they tail off next year, and whether the long-term demand for consoles has actually peaked. And it's really only in the months and years to come that we're going to be able to see how much damage the rise of mobile gaming has done to what used to be the traditional part of video gaming. So some people have even gone as far as declaring consoles dead and saying this will be the last cycle. That may be overdoing it a bit, but that's really the big question that hangs over these launches.
Well, that's our fun and games this time. Please join us again next week for another look at the week ahead. From London, this is The Economist.